All right, folks. So this is Visual Basic Chapter 10 presentation video. And this chapter will be talking about using databases with our Visual Basic applications. In class, we've been dealing with Access databases all year. And fortunately for you, with this chapter, we're going to continue to use Access databases as our database source. The nice thing about the method we're going to be using to connect to our databases is with one line of code, we could switch the connection out to connect to any other database that we wanted to. We're going to use Access because it's easy, it's accessible, we have it. We don't have a database server in the classroom to connect to and use, so Access just tends to be a lot easier to deal with. So that's what we're going to be doing. And again, in this chapter, there will be 4 questions throughout the presentation that I would like you to answer. So just do that in a Google Doc and submit it, and we'll get going. All right, so some of the things we'll be talking about in this chapter is understanding database files, and a lot of that will be review for you guys because you've been using databases and Access all year. We'll talk about connecting to a database using ADO.net. ADO.net is just one of the tools that Visual Studio uses to connect to a database. ADO stands for ActiveX Data Object, and .NET is just a framework. There are many ways to connect to a database in Visual Studio. You have ADO.net, you have ODBC, you have OLEDB. ADO tends to be one of the easier ways to connect to it, and you'll see when we start using it, it's pretty much a wizard that you go through and allow you to easily just drag your fields onto the Windows form, kind of like what you do in Access, although with Visual Basic, you'll have a much cleaner interface. You'll be able to, it'll be much more secure. Access is great for doing, little databases for, small offices where you're going to have 3 or 4 people using it. But as you get to bigger implementations, you're going to start moving away from Access and moving into SQL Server or Oracle or databases like that. And Access is good for prototyping. So a lot of times, before you move to a big database, you'll prototype something in Access, maybe build the front end for it in Visual Basic. And if the user likes it, then you can take that Access database, port it over to SQL Server or Oracle or whatever, and then with your VB program, you basically just change one line of code. You change the connection string from the path to the Access database to where the server for the other database is, login ID, password, and that's pretty much it. So it makes it pretty easy. So we'll be using ADO.net to connect to our databases, but there's many ways to do it. We'll talk about connecting your form objects to that data source. There's a couple steps you have to go through to get it all connected, but it's really pretty easy. We'll talk about binding database fields to the Windows Forms objects, and you probably did something similar to this in Access. Talk about different ways we can access database information on the Windows Form object. Again, very similar to what you've been doing this year in Access. And built in with that ADO controls is functionality for adding a record, deleting a record. So that's all built in there, so you don't have to add any extra code to do that. We'll talk a little bit about selecting records from the list and doing some programming beyond what the database wizard does. The database wizard is really good, but a lot of times you want to go beyond that, so that's when you have to start adding code. All the stuff that we've previously been talking about, binding the database objects and putting everything together, you don't have to write any code. The wizard does it all for you. It's going to write the code and put it in there. But in our forms that we're going to be creating, we're going to want to kind of sum things up and do some averages and stuff like that. And for that, you're going to have to use loops and write a little code. So we'll get into that a little bit too, more in the guided program walkthrough though. And then we'll talk about creating the OLEDB data adapter object for doing those more advanced things we might want to do with databases. All right, so this is what the guided program walkthrough is going to look like. So the screen on the left is the form on the left is the form you're going to be creating. So it's an application for some kind of a contest for a game design. So artists created some art for a game that you're creating, and you're collecting the art ID, the artist's name, the title that they created, the location where they created it, if the collection is public or private, and the price of that art. And then there's a button at the bottom to calculate the total retail value of all the records you have in the database. And you can see there's 16 records in this database. And this should look pretty familiar to you over here. Access database. So this database only has one table with artists, and that's all the records you'll be seeing. So in this form, you're viewing one record at a time. And we'll talk about these controls we have and what we can do with them. Again, this should look pretty similar to what you see in Access so far this year. So a lot of this will be familiar, some of it will be new. So a database. A database is a collection of related information stored in a structured format. So relational databases is what we've been dealing with. There's other types of databases, but typically in business situations, you're dealing with relational databases. So a database organizes data into tables. Each row in a table is referred to as a record, and each column in the table is referred to as a field. The unique field is an identifier that represents a primary key for the table. So we know most tables that we deal with have a primary key, especially if we're dealing with multiple tables, because that's how we relate the tables together. So question 1 for this chapter is, what is a database? So it should be an easy one. You shouldn't even have to look that up. Again, question 1 is, what is a database? All right, so this is just showing again what the table looks like that we'll be viewing the data from. So we have an artist's name, location, and the price. I think there's 16 records in the database, but through the application, you're going to be able to add more and delete more and play with that. So pretty straightforward table structures, not anything too crazy here. And I think most of the apps you'll be creating are pretty simple, but just want to give you some exposure to connecting your applications to a database. So the first step in accessing a database information is to establish a connection with the database source. So to connect a Visual Basic application to data in a database, you can use the data source configuration wizard. Wizards are nice. You don't have to do a lot of code. It does all the coding for you. It's going to step you through, ask you the questions, and then you've got something to start working with. The data is available in the data sources window for dragging onto a Windows form. So once you go through that data source configuration wizard, all you really will have to do is take the fields from that data source you created and drag them onto your form. And they'll create text boxes, they'll create labels for you, and you can just modify them as you see fit for font and size and everything else like that. A data set is an object. A data set object is a temporary cache storage for data retrieved from a data source. So you're going to take the data from the database, put it into a data set temporarily so you can display it on in the Windows form. Okay, so that's temporary. It's not an actual, you're not actually looking at the database. You're taking a temporary copy of it and putting it in the form. That data set will be updated. And if you have to delete anything or modify everything, you push that back to the actual database. And that's what the ADODB or ADO.net does for you. So this screen on the right shows you what your Solution Explorer is going to look like once you add your data set. So once you've created that data set, you're going to see a new object in here. It shows you you've got a connection to your data set. So dataset string is called data binding. Data binding allows you to display each field as an object on the form. So in the R project window, you're going to point to the data sources tab on the left side. So when we go through the guided program walkthrough, I'm going to show you how to display that so you see anything. If the data sources tab is not visible, tap the view menu, tap or click other windows, and then tap data sources. You tap or click data sources to view the data sources. And then you can expand the artist table to see the list of fields that you can place in the Windows form object. And I think the next slide shows you an example of that. Yeah, so this is when you display your data sources, you see the artist table and you see all the columns that are in that table. And then you can just simply click on these and drag them over to your form. And it's going to create the text boxes and create the labels for you. So it's kind of nice. And those are automatically bound to the database. So any changes you make to them automatically will get reflected in the database, just like in if you were doing it in Access. So Visual Studio automatically creates a data binding to populate the form by binding the form object to the dataset information. After the first field item is placed in the Windows form, a navigation toolbar called the binding navigator appears in the form. So that is this section right here. So you have a couple controls here: move first, move previous, move next, move last, the little plus for adding a new record, X for deleting a record, and the blue disk for saving data. Okay, so those are all the functions that are automatically created with ADO.NET to interact with the database. And again, it's very similar to what you might see in Access, in your Access forms you've created. So question 2 for you is name 5 of the functions that the data binding or the binding navigator provides for your app automatically. Okay, so what are the 5? There's more than 5, but name 5 of the functions that the binding navigator provides for your app. So once you've dragged your fields onto your form, it's going to look pretty much like this. Okay, so you're going to have a text box and a label. If you want to change these, again, these are just regular labels, so you can change the name of them. And we'll put a naming convention in, but it's not our standard naming convention that we use. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the guided program walkthrough. So we've got our add record functionality. So you can click on the plus, that'll allow you to add a record. After you've added it, you saved it, it writes it to the database for you. And then the same way you can delete a record. So whatever your record you're on, if you hit delete, it's going to remove that record from the database. And remember, there's no undo function in here. So once you delete a record, it's gone. And we'll in the app we'll talk about selecting the records. We're going to actually write a little bit of SQL later on in the guided program development to show you how to kind of go beyond the wizard that we're working with to set this up initially. So when we go beyond the wizard, we have to start writing SQL. And I'm making this video a few months before I anticipate that you'll be doing the coding on this, but I'm expecting that we're going to go through a little short SQL class that'll teach you how to write some pretty basic select statements so for connecting to the database. So we've been dealing a little bit with Access in class. For my After Dark people, we haven't done a lot with Access, but we'll get you up to speed on that when we get here. You don't really need to know it. You just need to know SQL for this. So basically, you're just writing a select statement, select from that artist table, bring all the records back, put them in a temporary data set. And this is the path that you use to connect to the database. So for this one, we're connecting to our Access database, and we're giving a path here to where it lives. If we were connecting to a SQL Server database, for instance, it'd be a different provider. Here, it wouldn't be ACE. ACE is Access. It would be SQL Server or something like that. We'd have to provide a server name, a login ID, and a password. And then this application could automatically connect to a SQL Server database, assuming that you have the exact same database in SQL Server with all the same table names and fields. That's a nice thing about connecting to databases. SQL is SQL, doesn't matter what database you're in, pretty much. So you can switch back and forth between databases if you need to. So this is some of the code that you're going to actually have to add into your application to kind of go beyond the wizard and put some more functionality in. Pretty simple. A lot of it is standard stuff that's going to be pretty much the same for each program you write. So in order to do that, you need to fill what's called a database, a data table, and a data table is needed to hold the data retrieved from that connection. After the data table is initialized, it must be filled using the fill command with the data from the selected table. This is just a temporary data table. So you connect to the database, you fill the data table, and you disconnect from the database. So to disconnect from the database, use dispose command, and that's important because when you connect to the database, you can have multiple connections. Just think about this being an app that's used in the real world. You could have 20 users. If they're each using this application, you now have 20 connections to the database. If you don't dispose of that connection, it's going to keep going up and up and up, and eventually you're going to have hundreds of connections to the database. The database is going to crash. It's going to get buggy. So it can happen that you're in the middle of doing something, the application crashes, you don't dispose of that connection, then you have open connections, and then you have to usually reboot computers and do stuff like that. And that's when we get memory leaks in computers. So using that dispose command is important for a couple of reasons. One being memory issues, and the other being it's just cleaner to actually close your connections when you've opened them. So the next question is, and I think I missed question 3, so I'm going to go back to that. Why do we need to use a dispose command when we're connecting to our databases? So why do we use a dispose command? Let me just go back a slide. Yeah, so I had question 3. Question 3 that I missed is, what does SQL stand for? So what does SQL stand for? Okay, so this is just an example of some of the code you're going to write when you're connecting to the database to go beyond the wizard. So in this example, what we're doing is we're connecting to the database so we can loop through all the records to sum up that retail price field that's in that table. So we can go through this quickly, line by line. We'll do it in a little more detail when we we'll do it for real when we do it in the guided program development. So we declare a variable for our SQL string. So this is a string. This is a SQL we're going to write to select all the records from our artist table. And like I said before, you will go through a SQL class, so you're familiar with what select star from artist means. And we declare our path here. This is just our connection, basically our connection string, how we're connecting to the database. So we need to provide the driver here, or provider, and this is pretty standard for an Access database, and then the path to the database. And then we create a data adapter using the SQL string and the path here. And that kind of opens a connection to the database. A couple of variables here for our data table, our count, and then our total value. Oops. And then we fill that data adapter with our data value. And then we dispose of that data table. So we connect to it, we put the data from it in the data value, and then we dispose of it, and then we're going to link through those. It says data value, but it's really a table here. So for count 0 to the number of rows in our data table, so we're going to loop through all those rows, and we're going to look for the retail price column, and we're going to sum it all up. So we're going to take that desk total value, go through each row, and add each retail price from that table to our desk total value. So when we get through all the records, we'll have a sum of all those values. So we loop through that. I think it's 16 times for this one. And then we're going to display that in our label. So we're going to make that label visible, and then display that total value in that label. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Most of the stuff we've done already. Just a couple new things with connecting to the database here. And just a reiteration of that last line where we're displaying that total value in our label, just like we've done in all our apps. All right, so this is a pretty quick video, I think, probably the quickest one I've done in a while for the guided program, for the presentation video. The guided program development is going to be pretty quick too. The GUI is pretty simple. We're not going to have to do a whole lot of stuff, and the coding is pretty much done for us. I think we're going to be adding 25 lines of code. So this will be a pretty quick chapter for you to go through. So this is the specification requirements document. You can have something similar to this for all the cases you do in this chapter. And then I think they have it as a use case here. So that is it for chapter 10. So answer those questions. And the next video will be the guided program development, which I think I'll be able to make as one video. I won't have to split it up. All right.